Hello, BookTube. This is the wrap up of week one of the Future History Project, a project created by Sean D. Standfast over at the channel of the same name and co hosted with him by Scott at the Bookish Bryants and myself. And then there's quite a few folks on a Voxer group, and we discuss these stories. We discuss Asimov. We go off on tangents about other things, and it's great fun. It's great fun. And I don't normally do a lot of book reviews. I do them occasionally, and I have some series that I do. But short stories, right? So to begin this Future History Project, it's all Isaac Asimov's created worlds or worlds, and there will be some other writers involved later on, but for the first month or so we're reading multiple short stories. So the future history that Asimov envisioned is made up of his robot stories, empire stories, and Foundation, and all those novels and stories. So, for the first week, everything was in the complete robot. And the first story is A Boy's Best Friend. I'm going to tell you when these things were done. They've got it printed right here in the back because it's interesting where they appear, and I think it does have some impact on how the stories were done. I mean, you make the story for the market, right? So, let's see. A Boy's Best Friend. It was first published in Boy's Life, 1975. So Boy's Life is a book, magazine, for Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts and that sort of thing back in the day. I'm sure it's still around. I haven't seen one in years. The next thing we read was Sally, and Sally was published in Fantastic in 1953. The next thing was Someday. Let's see where Someday shows up here. Sometimes they'll have more than one thing listed, so you actually have to look a little bit. Let me see. Well, I should be able to find it. Someday. I'll find it someday. Let me see. It's fun seeing all these different places. I mean, there's a thing here just at the Saturday Evening Post, not a story I've read yet. It was published in Infinity Science Fiction in 1956. Point of View. I just saw that. These are a little hard to line up here. I'm not going to keep looking. You get the general idea. So they're all over in these magazines. So the first story, and as Asimov, this book, Complete Robot, it's not every robot story ever done, but because he did some after this was put together, but he has them divided up not chronologically in the future history like we're trying to do, it's not publication date, but when the story occurs in the timeline. So this first section is some non-human robots. And then two of them will be in part two, which is some immobile robots. So A Boy's Best Friend is a young fella and his robot dog. And it was funny because I had my daughter read it because we saw a little robot dog on TV. And I said, hey, I'm reading a story about that. That's sort of fascinating. Well, they're on the moon. And they're close. And the dog had some capabilities, which helps keep the boy safe. And the parents, it seems to me like the father mostly, is thinking, well, my son needs a real dog, which seemed odd to me because, and probably to the boy, because the dog he had, a robot dog, was perfect for the environment, the harsh and dangerous environment of the moon, and the boy's out playing on the moon. So we see some play back and forth. It's a very sweet story. So it's really nice, very short, and you're left wondering. The boy loves his robot, and it's the interesting thing to me is that nostalgia bit, which I think some of the other hosts have talked about, or I know they have, I do that sometimes with my kids. You know, like, I'm over 60 years old, so I lived in a world where things were very different when I was young. Computer games were not around. Computers were, obviously. But we did different things. We had a much more outdoor lifestyle, and we live in a rural area, so that was even more extreme. And my kids do that stuff too. But of course, they love their video games. You know, so we don't try to force too much down their throat. Every once in a while, I think, well, you're playing a video game. Boy, you really ought to be reading Asimov. But you get my point. As a parent, sometimes you think, you know, I have it at the library. You know, a grandparent will come in and try to convince their kid to read the Hardy Boys, and they want to read Harry Potter. So it's a natural human thing. And the things you value, you think are eternal, but not always. So I really, really liked the story. And the next story, Sally, was pretty neat also, and had sort of a personal connection with me. So Sally is one of these cars, and there's a whole slew of these cars that are basically museum pieces, but they have computer brains, artificial intelligence. They're able to communicate with each other, which sort of comes out during the story. And they have a caretaker, a human. And then some bad guy comes along and wants to scavenge the parts. And the whole story revolves around how do the caretaker, the bad guy, and the cars themselves interact. Okay? So I was dragged as a boy to every car show within 150 miles of the house. And my dad was a car fanatic. And it got a little tedious sometimes. I like vehicles too, but his generation, that was a big deal. You know, he grew up in the 50s with a white T-shirt and a cigarette pack on his shoulder, you know, and if you were driving the right Chevy or whatever, it was a big deal. So the outcome of this story is a little disturbing. I'm not going to ruin it for you. It's longer than the first story, and it's fun. So, of the stories, those two are my favorites. Let's see here. Someday, it's about a little robot storyteller. It's dated, so I guess it's a. If you're a kid, you want the most up-to-date thing, right? It's telling like what we would think of as traditional fairy tales. And they don't really work in this modern world for most people. And a little boy has, again, it's in this case it's a little boy, and he has a friend, and his friend's like on the fast track to computer engineering fame, I guess. And it's how they try to update this robot and feed it new information. And the ensuing, was it good enough the way it was? Is new always better? What does my friend think of what I have? And that sort of thing. So I liked it. Not quite as much as the first two, but I did like it. It was not a bad story at all. Then we go into the immobile robots, he's calling them, which to me are really right. They're about computers. I mean, I guess there's a fine line, right? I think of a robot as a mobile computer with artificial intelligence or whatever. So this one's a little boy, and his dad works at Multivac, which is sort of like an old-fashioned IBM type of massive computer area. I actually got to visit one of those when I was a kid in the 1960s, and it was funny because the big to-do moment at the end of it was they had this printer at an end of a line of computers. You've seen pictures of them. They had the tapes, reel-to-reels, and the room had to be temperature. Everything had to be perfect, or else these things would break down. And everybody's walking around with white lab coats. And they brought in our school, and this was a big deal. And we got to the end of the table where the printer was, and in ones and zeros, it printed out an outline of a Snoopy head, and that was the highlight. So things have changed. But this boy gets into the company and that his dad works for, and obviously his dad's high up engineer or something, is having trouble with the computer because they can't track when it's right or wrong, and they're so dependent on it for everything in society that they're trying to engineer a way to figure out what's going on here. And the father and son, the boss tells the father, go take your son, go get a burger, take a break. We need everybody to take a break. And the boy comes up with a plan for, what seems insightful and from a child's point of view, obvious, to how to solve this problem. And I liked it. It was a good story, but the weakest, I think, so far. And let me find this last one here. I get it by the page numbers. Page 45. This book's already getting worn. Okay, this one here. It's the last one I read, and is one I remember the least. And it's about a woman scientist who is working with lasers, and she has redone the computer in her lab, even though she's not a computer scientist type. And she's got a project she's working on, and she brings in these two guys sort of as support because the powers that be are starting to wonder where her reports and stuff are. So she's sort of gone off track a little bit, but made some discoveries, right? And being a woman at the time, she's under scrutiny in ways that probably still happen, but was already, when Asimov's writing this, problematic, right? Because her work either wasn't going to be taken seriously, or she was going to she can't make the breakthrough the way a guy might have been able to. And I think the story reflects that and how she strategizes to correct that. And it's a good story, better than the last story, and not to me as good as Sally or the one about the boy and his dog. So 5 stories, really, really good. I enjoyed them. Strange to talk about without giving away all the details, but I do think that this is going to be good training for me going forward. So we'll do 5 more short stories, and I'll report next week, probably on the same day. Excuse me. It is cold out here. It's like, I think it's now up to 9 degrees outside Fahrenheit. And this is the little unheated part of the porch that I use as a little library. Doesn't get damp, so the books are fine. Anyway, got off track there. So I think this will be good training. I hope it is. Some of it will depend on the stories, right? This is the beginning of a huge project. I don't know when we're going to read the novels, but I enjoyed this very much. Like I say, it's Complete Robot. Isaac Asimov. The first 5 stories, I'll read you the titles again. A Boy's Best Friend, which I loved. Sally, which I really, really loved. Someday, Point of View and Think, which were less strong for me, but which I enjoyed. And so that is it. I hope to see you next week when we'll discuss the next 5 stories. Thank you, BookTube.